Hello, I'm Tom Harper, and welcome to That Wilbur Smith Show, a podcast about the life and legacy of the legendary adventure writer Wilbur Smith.
That entrance to the ancient city brought her past the Circus Maximus. The road to the Forum passed between the huge racetrack and the Caelian hill to the east, lit gold at that hour. The sun was low on the horizon, and she wanted to be safely indoors by nightfall. The imperial palace precinct would be lit, of course, as well as the eternal lamps that burned on temples to Jupiter and Vesta, but still, Rome was a dark city after sunset. Agrippina realized she had seen more Praetorians than the last time she was there. They seemed to be on duty at every corner, shrine, and monument, fully armed and armored. Under the shadow of helmets, they watched crowds hurry home to families and an evening meal. She found their presence calming rather than a source of fear. Where there were Praetorians, there was order. Her carriage rumbled slowly past the white walls of the circus. Agrippina repressed a grimace at the thought of Barbo's victories there. His greatest happiness lay on that track, as he had told her a score of times. He always looked wistful then, like a little boy. Even that thought was enough to make her clench her fists. Perhaps he had found glory too early in his life, so that all that came later was just a shadow in comparison. By one of the circus gates, a bronze statue was in the process of being pulled down by a team of workers. Still green, it had not yet mellowed to the golden brown of older pieces. Agrippina sent one of her slaves to ask, and learned that it was a likeness of Sejanus, one of the last in the city. Tiberius had been thorough in his destruction of the man's memory and line. Agrippina shuddered at that thought. Every moment brought her closer to the center of the web, where the slightest mistake could mean destruction. She raised her head. She had a son now, blinking and innocent, utterly reliant on her success.
That was from the new novel Nero, read by its author, Conn Iggulden. And I'm delighted to say that Conn is our special guest on this episode today. Conn really needs very little introduction. He's one of the outstanding historical fiction writers of our time. He burst onto the scene nearly over 20 years ago with his novel Emperor, the Gates of Rome, the start of, I think it was originally billed as a trilogy, but it became a quadrilogy and is now, I think, a pentalogy about the life of Julius Caesar. He followed up with novels about Genghis Khan, taking in the Wars of the Roses, ancient Greece, and even a foray into fantasy that I want to touch on later. And his latest novel, which is out in May, is Nero. So, Conn, I wanted to start by, first of all, saying welcome to the program.
Very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. I want to sort of jump back to the beginning, actually, because you were a school teacher, I think, before you were a writer, or before you were a published writer. Was writing historical fiction or writing fiction something you always knew you wanted to do?
No, not writing historical fiction. I didn't really think of it as a genre. I read all sorts of things. I read Wilbur Smith. I read fantasy novels. I read Bernard Cornwell and C.S. Forester, and I look back on it and think, well, why didn't you realize what you were reading? But they were just, I read John le Carré and Frederick Forsyth and all sorts. I read spy novels and crime novels, and I liked thrilling, what on earth is going to happen next sort of stories. And without really realizing it, I fell into a lot of historical fiction. The Courtenay books, for example, Wilbur Smith's Courtenay books, I read and loved the original ones, and then I was reading about the sons of a particular Courtenay, and then his grandsons, and the character then didn't even know about the grandfather. And I remember thinking, and it was a moment of revelation, I thought, my God, I know more about this man's grandfather than he does himself, because I was with him when he was, chopping down forests and bringing in tusks and all the rest of it. And that was an absolute revelation of how to write a series of books, and how there might be a whole level of interest to a reader in knowing the person's background to that degree, because to some extent that's everything I have always done. Bless you, Wilbur Smith, because for me, that everyone knows the Titanic sinks. It almost doesn't matter. It's how you get there. Everyone knows Julius Caesar was assassinated. It's who the characters are. When he sees Brutus walking across the floor of Pompey's theatre in Rome, and he must have thought at that moment, I'm saved. And then to discover that he wasn't, and to pull, we don't know why he did it, but to pull his toga over his head and no longer look at them as they continue to stab him, then you have a moment that is enriched by that. All the previous story, all the character work that's gone into it, that moment suddenly becomes far more than a simple recitation of events. It is no longer just the Titanic sinking. It is exactly how you got there. And that is, for me, the essence of historical fiction. And Wilbur Smith taught me one of the very valuable lessons. The more you know about how is the final result. And I owe him that. And I did actually have the chance to say that to him. So I was very pleased. Back in 2008, he wrote to me and emailed me. I was so surprised. I had my agent check with his agent to check it wasn't just somebody winding me up or having fun. And he wrote to me to say he read my books and enjoyed them. And I made exactly that point. I said, look, I think you taught me how to do a series. So I'm immensely grateful to you and always will be.
Yes, that's wonderful. I think there's nothing quite so special as having the people you idolized and read growing up and who are so formative on you to then actually be reading your own book and to get to meet them and to discover that they're sort of every bit as great as you thought they were.
Yes, he was fantastic, actually. He really was. I loved all of his work. I read Sunbird. I don't know if you know Sunbird.
Yes, we did that on the show a few last season.
I read it recently. I don't know why I picked it up. I'd read it years before, and a lot of his, sit on my bookshelves, and I haven't read them for a while, so I don't know why I picked up Sunbird. But I read it again and was gripped by it again, and was by the end, I was thinking he's much better than I am. That's the slight bittersweet of it, that he is a better writer than Conn Iggulden, unfortunately. And this was a masterwork, an absolute masterwork.
Yeah.
It stands against absolutely anybody. And it was a real joy to read.
Yeah, no, I recently read for the first time Men of Men. And again, I read that just thinking this is so good. And of course, I'm the guy who's got to try and carry on the legacy to a certain extent. So, and it's just that it's a losing game because he is so good.
Yes, there are some people. It's depressing to read them. To be honest.
Yeah.
Others, I think, okay, I can do this, but no,
he
wasn't really one of them. His example was too good.
Yeah, no, and there's this, and for someone like you who writes on such an epic scale, I mean, the way he does that, because you say it's not about the Titanic sinks, it's about who's on the Titanic, isn't it? It's the people exactly. that are on it.
At the end of the day, this is a hugely reductive sort of comment, but obviously it's about the people. I mean, the extraordinary thing about human beings is that we can empathize. As far as I know, nothing else in the universe can. We can look at someone else and imagine ourselves in their position. We can put ourselves in their story, and therefore we can feel fear for them when they're in danger, or hope alongside them, and so on. And that's the heart of all storytelling, that people are interested in people. At the end of the day, that's the story engine of absolutely everything. We are interested in people, and we can put ourselves in their position and fear for them. In fact, hang on, that was, the guy who wrote Slaughter, Kurt Vonnegut Jr. He said that his definition of fiction was, there's this, I'm going to misquote it now, but it was roughly, there's this guy, right, and he's a pretty good kind of guy, and then something bad happens to him. That's fiction.
Yeah, and I think for me, certainly, historical fiction, there's sort of two motivators. One is you read about these extraordinary events and you think, I just want to understand how that happened. Yes. And the other one is, I want to put myself in those shoes and imagine how I would have reacted in that circumstance. And generally, I'm thinking, because I think if I'd been in some of those situations, I'd probably just have, been cowering under my blanket. And yes. the way a Caesar would have responded or a Genghis Khan would have responded is very different.
Well, the difficulty was something like, I remember writing Julius Caesar and thinking at first, how on earth was I going to make this character a real man? He never lost a single battle. It's impossible. Hardly anyone can say that in all of history, especially someone who had decades of fighting in Spain and Gaul and Britain and God knows where else. And so you think, well, and then you start to come across moments, for example, when he was up against Pompey, and I think this was in Greece. And Julius Caesar tried a pincer movement at night, and it went classically wrong in that one side of the pincer got lost and came up against a river and couldn't join up with the other side of the pincer. It was exactly why you never try. We now would say, never try a pincer movement at night. That's madness. And this is why. So what happened was the other pincer attacked Pompey's camp at exactly the right moment, but with no support, were quickly routed and ran away into the night, passing Julius Caesar, who grabbed the signifer, the symbol of the regiment, and waved it, trying to hold them where he was. And at that point, if Pompey had attacked, that would have been the end of Julius Caesar. But Julius Caesar had established such a reputation for genius at this point that when Pompey's men said, right, we've got him, let's go, he said, no, wait. This is some sort of cunning plan. This is a trap. If we go out now, we'll be destroyed. So Julius Caesar's own reputation saved him in that moment where he lost completely everything. And it should have been the end of his career. But that was the point. He had a reputation for absolute genius, and Pompey never really understood how he did the things he did. But it was an interesting sort of relationship, trying to put a man like that onto paper and to describe, someone who ate and slept and went to the toilet, but at the same time was an extraordinary, unusual, rare, difficult man. And as I say, it was inside his head for 6 years, and I don't regret one of them.
As I said, you sort of broke out with your novel about Julius Caesar. You've gone all over the world and all over history since then. And now you've come back to ancient Rome. So I guess what I was wondering was what brought you back and why Nero in particular?
What brought me back is the fact that you never really leave Rome. I went to the city all my life. The first time I was there, I was 10. And then I started going with a girlfriend and later my wife. And I've been there almost every year for give or take 40 years.
Wow.
It's a city that sort of took my interest and my imagination from the very beginning. For me, I fell in love, I suppose, with that ancient history, as I did, without even realizing, first of all, that there was a genre called historical fiction. Always read people like Wilbur Smith and C.S. Forrester and Patrick O'Brien, but I wasn't aware of it as a genre. That was something that came through through writing.
Yeah, and
been to some
Nero?
extent my life's work. Well, Nero, you see, Nero, when I was originally writing Julius Caesar, I had to read Suetonius's The 12 Caesars, and some of it is pretty horrific. Bluntly, Julius Caesar is the beginning of the line, and Nero is the end. To some extent, it's an obvious bookending of the story. That's why I wanted to tell it. But then when I looked into the story, I began to realize that it wasn't what I thought it was, that Nero wasn't who I thought he was, that actually he was a completely different character, and that he had been, I felt, misrepresented, missold, in a very similar way to Richard III in England, in that the worse his successors could make him look, the better they seemed in comparison.
Yeah.
And it seemed to me a very similar engine. Suetonius was writing for Trajan and for Hadrian, and he was writing in a way that justified them by undermining the final bloodline of Julius Caesar. Because the people who followed Nero were generals like Galba and Otho, whose wife had been seduced by Caesar and left Otho. Would you trust a man whose wife turned against you in that way? Would you trust him with the record of your life? It's a peculiar situation. And I began to realize, I felt that Nero had been sold to us as a monster, and that although he had flaws, good God, obviously, but it was partly because he didn't write his own history. He didn't get the chance. If Julius Caesar had written a scene about Caesar standing in his theatre as it burned down around him, singing some great epic of Homer from the stage, it would be a magnificent scene. It would not have been spun into, Nero fiddled while Rome burned, or Nero didn't care while the people suffered. And that's part of it. that I felt that he was a victim of propaganda to a degree, and therefore there was a job to be done here, where I could rehabilitate Nero to a degree. To a degree I felt he deserved.
Yeah, and you said that the one thing you knew about Julius Caesar was that he was stabbed, which is probably true of many people. The one thing people know about Nero is Nero fiddled while Rome burned.
It is literally the one thing. I mean,
Yeah,
I've asked a few people. They know Nero and the Great Fire and the fact that he was involved in it in some way, and that is it.
yeah.
They don't know, for example, that he literally won the Olympics in Greece for chariot racing, poetry, music. I mean, he was an extraordinary man, and the Greeks, who were no fools, I should point out, he successfully competed in 3 major competitions in Greece. But the Olympics was actually going to be the next year, and rather cleverly, they moved the Olympics 6 months early so that he could take part and win. And then the result, of course, was that he remitted all taxes, all Roman tribute and taxes from Greece. He freed Greece, and as he said, other men have freed cities. I have freed a nation. I mean, he was an interesting man, and far more interesting than just another lunatic like Caligula. I think he was tarred with that same brush. Unfortunately, Tiberius destroyed and damaged Caligula. Caligula was so horrific, it left ripples. He left ripples through history for a generation. Claudius did great things in many ways, and interesting things, and revised a lot of the Roman constitution and habits and traditions. But Nero, to some extent, was painted with the same brush as those 2 previous monsters, and unfortunately, I don't think it was deserved.
Although having talked about Nero and kind of what he becomes, this book, I mean, he starts the book as a fetus, and I think by my calculations, about 11 years old when we get to the end of it.
Yeah.
So this is very much first chapter. I assume there's going to be more. I hope
Well, I
there's
have
going to be
written
more.
3.
You have? Oh, great.
Yes, I mean they are all written, all finished, and all with the publishers. I was intent on finishing a story that gripped me to an extraordinary degree. So I wrote in a sort of a purple patch, I suppose you can say. I fell in love with the writing of that particular story, and although I will say as a preamble that I am as careful as I can be not to apply modern values to ancient Rome. They have completely different attitudes to things that we think we understand, like suicide, for example. They have a completely different attitude to suicide, that
Yeah.
it is a perfectly noble way to step out of the room, effectively. If you cannot be oppressed in Rome, because you can merely say, thank you very much, disappear into another room and give yourself the chop. The attitude is quite different, and therefore you should be very careful applying any sort of modern understanding of psychology or indeed damage to these characters. However, after that preamble, that said,
Yeah.
Nero's mother, Agrippina, is an extraordinary character who survived such appalling damage that I found that she was a sort of engine for the whole thing. I mean, if you remind yourself that her father, Germanicus, was probably murdered. Her mother clearly thought so. Her mother claimed that he had been murdered by great men in Rome, to the point where she therefore crossed a few of the wrong people and was blinded, exiled, and sent to die in exile. She never managed to come back. You've got Agrippina's 2 older brothers who were technically possibly in line for the throne of Rome, so they were murdered. The 3rd brother was taken to Capri by Tiberius, and he became Caligula. She was married at the age of 13 to a violent man at the age of 30, Gnaeus Ahenobarbus, a man who was most famous for blinding one of his social equals when he disagreed with him at an argument and running another one down on the Via Appia in a chariot. He was a man of extreme violence and threat. And Agrippina, after years, fruitless years of marriage, suddenly gets pregnant and has her one and only son, Lucius Ahenobarbus. And that is an extraordinary mother to bring an extraordinary child into the world. And her struggle, not just to sort of thrive, but to survive the extraordinary courts of Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, is one of the great stories in history. And then her struggle as Nero. I mean, Nero became emperor at 16 and died at 30. And the struggle between that young man, whose mother obviously thought she could rule through him, or rule as a sort of dowager empress with all the power, and he would merely be the mouthpiece. And that struggle between mother and son is one of the great stories. That's what gripped me and took me right through 3 books. I mean, there's an awful lot of story in this, but it's the best material I've ever encountered. And in 25 years of writing, that's a statement.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, and don't forget, you have major events like the Boudica Rebellion. I've given up on Boadicea, by the way, because nobody will go for that. I prefer the sound of it, but I accept that nobody truly knows, so you could go either way. But
Yeah.
the consensus appears to lie with Boudica. But you've got the Boudica Rebellion, which killed up to 70,000 people in England. And obviously you have the whole invasion of Britain under Claudius as well. I mean,
Yeah.
as well as the Great Fire of Rome and building Nero's, extraordinary house, the Domus Aurea in Rome, you have some of the classic events of the ancient world happening in this storyline, which is just a joy. I can't tell you how much of a joy it is to write about this sort of thing. So I used to say historical fiction writing was being a god of the gaps. You had to fill in these places where nothing was known. And that's true to a degree, because you can't simply say Julius Caesar walked up to the fort and then cut to the next chapter 3 years later, because something has to happen in fiction which doesn't necessarily get written down in real life. And that, for me, is a lovely sort of puzzle solving part of the story. But it's that extra dimension that historical fiction can add to sometimes a dry history book.
Yeah. No, and I think that's why so many people fall in love with historical fiction.
And of course, it has to be accurate. That's the other thing. That's the other interesting part of historical fiction, and the great debate that goes on.
Yeah.
The importance of accuracy. And I've ridden that roller coaster up and down and every which way over the years. I didn't know when I started out. I will say, in some ways, I was quite naive that if I, for example, made a decision without really taking too much time over it and decided that a shield shape should be like a lozenge or should be circular or something, that I would have emails from people possibly 20 years later telling me that I'd got it completely wrong and that I was an idiot. And this kind of thing, but I had no idea walking into that thresher that this was part of the world. And I appreciate it much more now than I did. There are, I think, mistakes I made, not all of them, but when I started, and I put Julius Caesar and Brutus closer in age than most people do. And I thought that was justified by aspects of the story. I wanted it to be a story about two men together, growing up and growing into manhood together. I thought that would make a better story. But it was a choice. It was a fictional choice that other people have objected to. And I still get emails saying, Brutus was Julius Caesar's son, so how could you possibly do this? And I used to reply and sort of say, look, he was engaged to Julius Caesar's daughter at one point. Even in old Rome, they didn't do things like, you didn't get the son. No, Brutus cannot have been Julius Caesar's son. But I still get people emailing me sometimes about the use of the word corn.
Right.
Because
yes.
in England, sometimes if you Google a cornfield in England, you will get what is obviously a wheat field. And we use the word sometimes to mean wheat, and sometimes we don't use it to mean corn on the cob, although we also use the word corn on the cob. Every American knows that corn comes from South America and is maize and all the rest of it. So the number of emails over the years that I've had from people saying there was no corn in ancient Rome, you idiot, is just, one word. And that was an English American thing separated by a common language. But what I've learned over the years is that people really do appreciate the more accurate, the better, really.
So, yeah, you've been talking about the importance of accuracy. Another thing that we also talk about a lot on this podcast, and which is so important in Wilbur's world, and also, I think also in your novels, is the sense of place. And you've talked about how you've been to Rome, I think you said pretty much every year of your life, or certainly your adult life. Is that important to you as well, like walking the ground and being in the actual place?
It's honestly, it's vital. Something that Wilbur Smith mentioned about my books, about appreciating. And I hope it's because I put the time in. I mean, with Rome, I obviously went to Pompey's theatre and stood where Julius Caesar is meant to have been assassinated, and then walked from there to the Capitoline Hill and over it and down into the Forum, because I knew that was the route taken by the assassins. And I knew from the description at the time that they held up their hands with blood on their hands to show that they were not criminals. They were not afraid of what they had done or ashamed. They actually were proud of it. And they had, coins cut later to commemorate, if that's the right word, or celebrate, I suppose, saving Rome from tyranny, as they put it. So I wanted to walk that kind of route to see how they had done it. And in a similar way with Nero, I walked down from the Palatine down into the Forum, just knowing that he would have taken that route. And you come down by the Colosseum, which wasn't there at the
Of course,
time.
yes, it's easy to forget that, isn't it?
Yes, well, it's always tricky to remember what was there and what wasn't. But the reason, funnily enough, Nero had a house called the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, and it was a vast sort of Xanadu kind of a place with columns, and it had a rotating dining room, and it had hot and cold and sulfurous water and all sorts of things. And he had a statue of himself as Apollo, covered in gold leaf, with sun rays coming from his head. And it was 110 to 120 feet high. So it was known as the Colossus. And it was at the base of that hill where, when it was dragged away, Trajan needed 24 elephants to remove part of the thing it stood on. The amphitheater that they put up afterwards was known as the Colosseum, not because of its own great size, but because it was the Colossus. That's where that had stood. The memory of Nero in his house and his gardens is still very much alive today in those buildings. But when it comes to other places, like with Genghis Khan, I sat down to write those books and realized that I had to stop because I couldn't visualize it. I had no idea what the colors were like, what birds you would see. And with historical fiction, I've always been afraid of what I sometimes refer to as the Amalfi Lemon problem, which is that if you wrote about the Amalfi Coast today, you would write about lemons.
Yeah.
And because they're absolutely everywhere, they eat them, they put them on food, they make liquor out of them, alcohol out of them. They're in, the whole hillsides are terraced to make lemon groves and so on. And it's a vital part of knowledge. And I always fear that there's something in some part of the ancient world that I might miss, but everyone is meant to know. Something like the fact that there are lemons all over the Amalfi Coast, or that everybody had a pet pelican, or God knows what. And I always fear that I would miss some vital part of it. So, you end up doing the most research you can, but I had to go to Mongolia because I couldn't imagine what the place looked like. I didn't know if it was desert. It does have a Gobi Desert, of course, it's on the edge of it, or what sort of green it was, or what animals I would encounter. As I've said in other places, it looks a lot like Wales. I didn't know that at the time. It would have saved me quite a lot of, hardship if I had known that. It looks almost exactly like the Brecon Beacons, but it is an incredibly beautiful place. And I will say that there were elements of scale that I had never encountered before. For example, at one point we were driving in a Jeep. I was there with a guide and a young woman. And we did about 40 miles an hour, give or take, too fast, actually. We burst a tire when the road dropped away. But we did about 40 miles an hour, apart from changing the wheel, for about 8 hours, when I was being jostled around like a pea in a drum in the back seat. And at the end of that 8 hours, we were still in the same valley. Wow. And I had never encountered that scale before. It was absolutely ridiculous. Or that level of being away from the safety net of civilization. When strange riders came up and wanted something from us, oranges in the example that I'm remembering, we weren't in any danger whatsoever, but potentially if things had gone wrong, then there was no safety net. There was no one to call. If I was bitten by a rabid dog, I went to get my shots at the beginning, and I said to the woman who was about to inject me with the rabies one, what sort of protection does it give me? And she said, well, you still need to get to a hospital within 24 hours. And I thought, well, I'll be a minimum of 5 days, minimum of 5 days away from the hospital. So I didn't bother having those because I thought, well, that's just a waste of time and money. But then when you're riding a pony and you see coming through the grass at you like a homing missile, a dog that's come out from someone's house, from their ger tent, like a yurt, and has come out and is arcing through the grass to come and hit you at some point of the arc, you begin to panic a bit. Then you're digging in your heels and getting going. And it was things like that. In Mongolia, I'm not a great horse rider. I never have been, but we were doing 20 miles, 25 miles a day. And it might not sound like much, but I developed saddle sores, for example. And they were absolutely brutal. And I had been told to say no thank you to the Mongolian saddle, which was wooden, and therefore was absolutely brutal to the tender nethers of a non-rider. But I was told to ask for, I think the Russian saddle was what they said, which was leather, but it had an iron hoop at the front of it, with which I became intimately acquainted as I kept bouncing onto it. And as I say, I practically wrecked myself underneath during this process. But this was all, I mean, an actor uses all sorts of things, but a writer uses things they encounter, and stories. And, we went into, I've said this before, we went into a village and there was a totem pole in the village, a proper carved head totem pole. And I said to my guide, it was like, for me, it was like finding a grand piano. I was amazed to find it. It didn't, I said, what is that? Why is that here? And she said, oh, well, about 15,000 years ago, give or take, we crossed the Bering Strait and, went down through, Canada. She said, this, Canada and North America. And I said, no, I don't know this. And I don't think this is general knowledge. And she said, oh, yes. And some of them came back and, and she said, and I sort of worked out, that she was saying that the Mongolians, with their reddish skin and jet black hair and love of the pony and their tribalism and their worship of the Sky Father and the Earth Mother, that they were the ancestors of the Sioux and the Apache and the Inuit and absolutely everyone in Canada and North America who was there sort of 15,000 years ago. And at the time, that wasn't general knowledge. She was able to say it from a sort of, I can only assume, an oral tradition going back that far, where they all knew this. And the Bering Strait, of course, is, I believe, still vaguely crossable today. It probably melts a bit, to be fair, but it was crossable back then. And this was a part of her history that I would not have encountered had I not had that conversation and seen an artifact of North America as I saw it in Mongolia. I just never would have seen that. But it's been confirmed since with DNA links and all sorts of things, and confirmed that is true. But that vast migration of peoples thing, something that Wilbur Smith would have been interested in, I think, was known to them and not to me. I had to go there to find that out. And for me, that's always been the rule number one. If I possibly can, I will visit every location in the book, or do everything that is necessary. If I did a sailing scene, and I did the sailing scene with my brother. I went on a tall ship in the Pacific because I needed to see the 1,001 sensory experiences of being on a ship. He was in the Merchant Navy for 30 years, so he knew all about it. Loved teaching me how to tie a bowline and all this business. But it was seeing dolphins, scooting under the prow, or the dolphin striker, as it was on that ship, was one of the joyous experiences of my life. And it was something I used. I use absolutely everything. Even the fact that my brother once stabbed me in the foot because we were playing mumblety peg or whatever it was, except with a foot and a bayonet. And I went, right as he went right. And he said it was an accident. But even the fact that it didn't hurt, that getting stabbed actually didn't hurt at all. I've used every part of that. Not necessarily exactly like that, but you use these little things that happen to you, the things you witness, the stories you hear, all the time in historical fiction, because they're true. And I think it's important. I've never killed anyone, for example, but my father, did see me when I was a baby, and apparently he said, I hope he never has to kill anyone, which is a terribly sweet thing to say for ex-RAF man. That was nice. But this kind of thing, you have to fill those gaps, I suppose, with getting the knowledge as close as you possibly can.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, Wilbur lived such an adventurous life that it almost just happened to him. But for those of us from less exotic parts of the world, as you say, we have to go out and find them. I think it does speak to the fact of what a kind of natural storyteller and writer you are, that even being stabbed in the foot, you're thinking, oh, I can use this.
Yes, my wife says I forget all sorts of things at anniversaries, but I remember things in terms of stories. And that is true. That is how those are the bookmarks of my life. But actually, just on the subject of Wilbur Smith, I was thinking about Sunbird the other day. And it's not just the fact that there's an element of historical fiction to it, although I love that. And the Carthaginians, and it's the physical description of the bees finding water in the wilderness, where following that, and it was the way he described it. And I thought, that was an incredibly beautiful description of the natural world. And for me, that's always been one of the great hallmarks of Wilbur Smith. The fact that he loved Africa, obviously, and he loved South Africa, but he loved the wild places, and he described them absolutely, beautifully.
Yeah, I think in that scene, is it something like he sees the pollen coming off their wings or off their legs or something? It's such a microscopic description,
yes,
and
yes,
literally
certainly a
only if you'd
reflection
seen
of
them.
light.
Yes,
Yes, I mean
that's
that's
right. Yeah,
exactly the kind of thing that brings this scene alive. It's
yeah,
wonderful.
yeah. No, he's I mean, unparalleled at that. Um, Taking as my lead the being stabbed in the foot with a bayonet by your brother. At sort of the height of the success, as you do, at the height of the success of the Emperor series, you took what to me looked like a kind of massive swerve, and you published the Dangerous Book for Boys.
Yes, I mean it never, that didn't feel like a swerve to us because that was never meant to be anything more than a side project. It just happened to turn into a book, like nothing else. That was something I've never experienced. That sort of sudden interest. I mean, I went on American chat shows, if you can believe it, to talk about boys and what they should be doing and how to raise how to raise them, and it was extraordinary. I've never known anything like it. But my brother said to me, "Do you think it'll be a bestseller?" And I gave him some spiel. I said, "Look, there's something like 10,000 books published a year, and there's only a tiny percentage of those ever get onto a bestseller list, and the chances, blah blah blah." And then it went to number one. It stayed there for about 6 months. It was absolutely unbelievable. It got to number one in America in the New York Times, and I have never encountered that sort of success before or after. And the extraordinary thing, I think, was that I genuinely didn't think anyone would be interested in it. And I said to my brother, look, the worst case scenario is that we get a sort of, the publishers will send us a nice edition that will sit on our shelves forever. And then, this is something we can have and be proud of. And that's something I felt I was doing that for my brother to some extent, because I already had books with my name on, but I was bringing him into this part of my world. And of course, he remains convinced to this day that the reason it was more popular than other books that I published is because he was involved.
Yeah.
But, that is an unavoidable sibling comment. But it was the extraordinary thing for me was that other people were interested in it in other countries as far apart as China and America and Britain, whereas I thought because we had quite an old father, and he had an incredibly old father. His father was born in 1850. So he was 73 when he had my dad, and my dad was 47 when he had me. So in 2 generations, we go back a long way. And wow. I thought that no one was going to be interested in the things that still interested us. I've got 3 chapters on grammar in there. Come on. I mean, I've got the subjunctive mood described in this book. I didn't think I've got the 10 Commandments and a bit of commentary in there. I've got stories of courage and conquers. And I honestly thought, every modern kid is going to be playing around with this phone. And what I didn't expect is that their parents would care very much that they knew, who Nelson was and who Douglas Bader was and Julius Caesar and sort of some of those daft skills and varied interests that we had as boys. And all we were doing really was just recalling, oh God, do you remember we used to do the bow and arrow and how we used to make it? And the bow and arrow, I think we could probably make a better one as adults, but I didn't. I made it in the same way we made it as when we were kids, because that was what I wanted to do, that level of technology, if you like. And that was fun. Finding out that other people cared about it as much as we did was enormous fun. And I have to say, a surprise. And it really restored my faith in humanity.
Yeah, I was reflecting on it just as I was preparing for the show, and I was remembering that time and how it was a genuine phenomenon, and every other publisher rushed out a kind of copycat version of it, and for sort of years afterwards, it was extraordinary.
I've got most of them. I think I bought them. There was a Dangerous Book for dogs and all sorts of things. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah.
So I mean, I've got them all on a shelf somewhere. Yeah, good fun.
Yeah, But one of the things that's interesting, I remember we did an event around the time that it was out, and I remember talking to you about it at the time. And as well as all the stuff about bows and arrows and soapbox races and conkers and stuff, there was also a lot of history in there, which you sort of alluded to. And I remember you saying that you'd actually had a bit of a struggle with the publishers to get some of the history in there.
Oh God! I mean, the main bit, the main struggle that I had. I mean, I've talked about this in other places, but it was originally with Bloomsbury,
Mm.
and when I handed it in, they said it's a great book, Con. We think they said it will sell shed loads, was the phrase they used. I must have mentioned this at the time, and they said, however, we think you should take out 7 chapters, and here are the 7 that we think you should take out. And I won't embarrass them by listing the 7, but they made it, or would have made it, a less pure version, I suppose.
Yeah.
I mean, one of them was certainly about hunting and shooting a rabbit, which I wasn't sure about at the time, but I felt that if you're going to eat meat, you should do that once, so that you should know what is involved, because it's not particularly pleasant, and there are certain skills involved, and so on and so on, and cutting up an animal to make a stew out of it. My brother and I sat there and we chewed and chewed and chewed. A wild rabbit is basically muscle and gristle, and dear God, I thought, this is never going to end. I don't know how I'm going to swallow this, and that's important.
Yeah.
I think you should know, that sort of thing. But that was when my brother actually completely justified his presence in the project, as it were, in writing the book, because I said to him, look, the publisher, what they said to me was, if you cut those 7 chapters, we'll sell shed loads, but if you don't, then we'll price it at 25 quid and do a limited edition and basically kill it stone dead. They didn't use those words, but that was the clear choice, if you want to call it a choice.
Yeah.
And so I said this to my brother, and he said, well, I don't care. He said, I want the book to come out that we've actually written. I don't want to cut a single chapter. And I said, well, that's brilliant, Harry, but how exactly can I go back to the publishers and say, you remember that nuclear option where you said, you'll kill it stone dead? I'd like to choose that, please. I mean, that's not going to work. So at that point, I went to HarperCollins and Susan Watt, and it was Bernard Cornwall. Funnily enough, he came first. I met him, and I had lunch with him because we shared an editor at that time, and I asked him what he thought I should do, and he said, send it to my editor, send it to Susan Watt, and we did. We put it on a moped and sent it across the city, and she read it and liked it, and then HarperCollins bought out Bloomsbury, and they had to pay a lot for costs. All the illustrations that had already been done, they had to buy off the illustrator, and Bloomsbury sort of had them over a barrel because they knew they wanted this, so they could ask almost anything they liked. So there was a lot of cost involved and a lot of trust by HarperCollins, for which I will always be grateful to them, because it allowed the book. And then they rushed it because they wanted to get it out for Father's Day, and because of that, I mean, I won't say it didn't go through editing, it did, but it didn't go through as much time and polish as some books. It came out, the first edition has some errors in. One of them, I had an old man of about 90 who wrote to me with a graph to show why my shadow stick that I said could be used to say the time of day was in fact wrong. And I had to take it to my dad. I said, look, I'm sorry, Dad, I can't understand the graph. And he had a look at it. He was ex-maths teacher and said, no, he's right. So we had to redo that chapter in the second edition. And I wrote a very nice letter to the man. But this was the kind of thing. The Dangerous Book brought out experiences that I've never had before or since, experiences like that. And it was despite the struggle of getting it to be published, it was just a joyous thing. It'll probably be the only thing I'm remembered for in 100 years, if anything at all. Who knows? And if that's true, then that's not such a bad thing.
Yeah. And it's I mean, obviously your historical fiction is you can see the kind of the lineage from Wilbur, and some of it's in the same world as that. But actually, The Dangerous Book for Boys also feels like a very Wilburish book. You sort of feel that if he'd had sort of the right age kids at that time, he would definitely be buying it for them.
Well, I know he did buy it. I'm very pleased about that, because yes, he said he bought it from Kalahari Books, which is very nice. It's a nice thing to know that other people read and enjoyed your books. It really is, especially when they're heroes of yours.
Also, I sort of feel that if you're going to buy The Dangerous Book for Boys, Kalahari Books is surely the best place to buy it.
Yes, I would have thought so. Gosh, yes.
Yeah. I'm intrigued. I was thinking about one of the big themes in Wilbur's books is obviously fathers and sons. And I was thinking about your books. I was thinking, something that Julius Caesar, Genghis Khan, and Nero all have in common is they all lose their fathers at
At
very
a young
young
age.
ages, and it's
Yes.
really changes their lives as inevitably it would.
I've
Um,
said this to my own children. I've said, I know this is a bit grim, but I've said to my sons in particular, the best thing I could do for you, it would be to die with you aged about 11, 12, 13,
yeah,
because it clearly creates a situation where the boy can never be given a pat on the shoulder and a well done, an attaboy,
mm,
as the Americans
yeah,
call it. And as a result, they spend their whole lives not necessarily happy, to
mm,
be fair, if that's your aim, but they spend their whole lives achieving extraordinary things because it can never be enough. They can
yeah,
never be satisfied. So yes, it's amazing how common that is in history, that a high achieving man is someone who lost his father between the age of 11 and I would go as far as 14.
yeah.
And it's in that band. So, every cloud, as they say.
Yeah. So, but you think it's the causality is the fact that this has happened to them, and as partially as a result, they've been kind of driven to succeed. You're not attracted to this as a sort of strange, sort of Freudian subtext, do you think?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, my dad lived to 92, and the truth is, of course, I loved his advice and his insight into previous generations. I mean, he really had seen a world that didn't exist. I mean, he saw England before the wars. He
Mm,
grew up in 1920s and 30s Sussex, for example.
mm,
Sorry, between the wars, I should say. And he was then, he dropped everything you can drop from a plane, from bombs to Gurkhas to leaflets to a French spy to anything that could be thrown out of a plane was thrown out of the plane that he was flying.
wow.
So he saw a completely different world, and I valued his advice right to the end of his life. But the truth is, if you take the aim of humanity as happiness, you would take one path. But if you take the aim of humanity as achievement, I don't know, reaching the stars, say, then maybe, you might have to lose some of the happiness to do it, some of the contentment in old age. Maybe
Mm,
you'd have to have people who are miserable but driven, and drive doesn't always come from contentment. In fact, the two things, may be exclusionary, I think is the right word.
yeah, yeah. Of course, another great theme of Wilbur's is brothers, and there's the rivalry between brothers is a major theme in a lot of books. And I noticed in your bibliography you brought a Dangerous Book for Boys with Hal, but then there's books credited to Conn, Arthur, and Cameron Iggulden, and Conn and David Iggulden. Are these
Yes.
all your brothers?
Yeah, well, no, Arthur and Cameron are my sons.
Right. Ah,
um,
okay.
and David is my older brother.
Right.
I do have another older brother, John, although I haven't ever written anything with him. Um, it's funny. I mean, it's a crucial relationship
Hmm.
to me, and I think it's one of those important sort of engines that I used to say when I was younger that the difference between my brother Harry and friends, if you like, was that if I had to bury a body, I would call Harry. That would be the relationship. The crucial difference. And I
Hmm.
don't know if that's always true. People grow up and they grow apart and they have their own families and so on and so on. But it's an important relationship when you're growing up, without a shadow of a doubt.
Are you going to reveal which was the one who stabbed you with the bayonet,
Oh,
or is
that was
that?
Harry.
Oh, it
Oh
was
yeah.
Harry. Okay,
But I
yeah.
mean, again, that was oh God, I mean, that was because we grew up very closely together, and yes, managed to cause each other quite terrible injuries. He claims to be the only one to ever be. He bloodied my nose, not the other way around, etc., etc. Oh dear, oh dear. All these memories.
Yeah, which again is also absolute kind of grist in the Wilbur, the way these young men characters grow up. You've obviously as well all your historical novels and indeed your dangerous manuals. In 2017, you branched out into fantasy with the Empire of Salt series, and I remember being in the bookshop and seeing it. I thought, "Oh, that's new," and I wondered sort of what inspired that move.
I'd always read fantasy. I mean,
Yeah,
it's the genre that I read, as well as historical fiction and I guess crime fiction, because I read a lot of that as well. Michael Connolly and Lee Child and all the rest of it. There are those are my three big genres.
mm,
So I've always read Brandon Sanderson, for example, and Terry Pratchett back in the day.
yeah,
But Raymond Feist, people like that, big epic. And I remember I said earlier I learned how to do series from Wilbur Smith, but I learned how to do scene breaks for want of a better word, by reading Raymond Feist, because he would split a plot into two. And then he would, instead of doing downtime, he would do right up to the climax and the exciting cliffhanger and the end of a scene or the middle of a scene, and then switch to the other one, so that you didn't have to deal with the boring 3 days when nothing happens. And I thought those were brilliant techniques, because fundamentally they're all about storytelling, about interesting people who, you know, are having struggles in some way or other. There is obviously a huge overlap between all of these things. And in fact, you could easily do a crime novel set in the past if you wanted to do Cadfael. Was it the old monk who used to solve? Yeah. And you could do one set in a fantasy world. I think Peter F. Hamilton used to did Greg Mandel. There was a crime series, I think he set in you know, science fiction in the future. The point is, people are interested in people, and to some extent, although these genres are separate, and there are people who wouldn't touch fantasy with a bar's pole, and I understand that position completely, or wouldn't like it to intrude in historical fiction and the other way around. Nonetheless, there's a pretty big overlap. Because people are interested in people, and therefore they're interested in characters and what happens to those characters, regardless of the genre. But it's a fair enough thing, you know. You do not want to solve your problems with Nero by introducing a dragon. You know,
although if Nero had a dragon, we can only imagine how history would have turned out.
You know, it just popped into my head, of course, that Naomi Novik, I think, wrote an extraordinary series where she had, as well, it was Napoleonic Nelson's navy, and it was ships like the Temeraire. But the Temeraire was a dragon. She did actually mix. I've just thought she mixed two genres together, and I thought successfully. It was an interesting, absolutely crazy mashup of genres. But I don't know if I could do that. But I wanted to write fantasy because I'd always loved the genre.
Yeah. And how did it compare with writing historical fiction?
Well, there was less research.
Yes.
I mean,
no one can call you up on the shape of the shields.
No, exactly. No one could do that, and also. It wasn't necessary to sort of solve plot problems within the very tight confines of the actual reality that went on. So, if you like, I had a freer experience in some ways, but I'm not sure I particularly enjoyed that. I mean, I do like the fact that I know that I have to get to this point where Nero wins a chariot race in Greece, for example, and there's only so many places I can go in between. The skeleton is laid out for me, and with fantasy, I could have gone absolutely anywhere. So I found it. I wouldn't have liked to try that at the very beginning of my career. I think I would have lacked the discipline or the experience to do it well. I think I did do it pretty well. I'm quite pleased with the books, and I enjoyed the experience. But I needed 20 years of sort of working. In producing something like a tightly scripted sort of historical fiction, so that I could not go completely off on, you know, get lost in a maze of a plot of my own creation.
Yeah, I found that the first time I wrote a novel set in the present day, actually, that again, there's so much more freedom, and you know so much more about the world than you do about a historical period. So again, it was like suddenly I'd been, you know, drinking from a sort of a trickle, and then suddenly you've got like the full fire hose coming at you, and deciding what you can include, because there is such a broad scope you can include, is actually much harder, I found.
That's an interesting perspective, and it does, for me, it harks back though to Wilbur Smith, because I remember reading the Courtenay books and the fact that he started, and I think it was 1600s originally, and then he brings it right up to the modern, or close to the modern day, and in one of them, a character of a young Nelson Mandela turns up. And I remember reading this and thinking, God, he was still alive at the time, and I thought, gosh, he could sue. And I remember it was so odd, because I was used to dealing with, you know, centuries and centuries back, and suddenly I was dealing with a young lawyer somewhere in South Africa, and I thought, if he wrote Nelson Mandela kicking a dog to death or something like that, then, you know, he could genuinely sort of get in trouble. So I felt reaching the modern day in that way was a constriction, was a set of rules that he had to be careful about. So I prefer to be lost deep in the past.
Yeah. You're not going to get sued by Nero, I guess. Although, yes, you're rehabilitating his reputation. He probably wouldn't sue anyway.
I think he'd be delighted. Yeah.
Yes. I counted about 30 books that you've written. Is that about right?
Yeah, give or take.
Yeah, give or take. In just over about 25 years, maybe. You've also raised 4 kids. Is that right? I think I've got my numbers right here. Yeah. Do you ever slow down?
Not at the moment. The Nero story poured out of me.
Yeah.
I've rarely written with that much energy. It's one of the reasons, of course, that I'm not particularly good at beginnings, I have to say. It's one of the reasons I like, I mean, beginnings I find murderous. So it's one of the reasons I like series is that I only have to do one beginning.
Right.
There's the reason I keep writing these series of 3, 4, and 5 books, because I only have to start once over 3 or 4 years. I mean, this is a fundamental truth for me. But I enjoy. Look, I mean, I know this is almost embarrassing to admit, because I enjoy what I do. My old English teacher said to me, that happiness was finding something you are good at and then seeing if anyone else would be willing to pay you to do it. And it's pretty good advice. And I found that I loved writing, and that I loved telling stories, and that people were willing to buy them, and the publishers were willing to pay me to do it. And therefore, once that door was opened, and don't forget, it was closed to me for 15 years before. I couldn't get a meeting, I couldn't get a foot in the door. And also, I still get turned down fairly regularly when I come up with something that the publishers don't like, because I do like to try other things. I wanted to write a book on personal finances recently, and the publisher said, although it seems like this is a good idea, Conn, you have no history of knowing anything about personal finances. You have no qualifications. You have not been anywhere near a university to do economics or anything like this. So the answer is no. So they turned me down at regular intervals. But I put that aside. I don't let it bother me. I move on to another subject. And I pick up the pen again, or I open a new Word file, because I do love what I do.
Yeah, well, that's wonderful. Although I think I speak for all our listeners when I say how sad I am that we won't get the dangerous book of personal finance.
Honestly, I think that I should self-publish that. That's a brilliant idea.
Well, on that note, I think your point about, as I say, if you can find something you love and then get other people to pay you to do it, that is indeed the secret of happiness. And I think you and I are very lucky to have found that.
Yes, to an embarrassing degree. I mean, this is why I hesitate mentioning it, but there's life. It shouldn't give you such an absolute basket of plums as being a writer actually is. But if you have the opportunity to do it, it's what I always wanted to do from the very, very earliest memories. I wanted to write. I'm sending books to publishers aged 11. I wanted to do this. And honestly, it is every bit as joyous as you imagine. It's a chance to tell stories. Who wouldn't want to be a storyteller?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's probably a good note on which to end it. So Conn, thanks so much for being on the show. It's been an absolute joy. I love the book, which is just out, and I look forward to seeing what you do next.
Well, it'll be Nero for the next couple of years, because they're done and in the pile waiting to go.
Yeah, well, your fans will be very pleased to hear that, as am I. So thanks so much for being on the show.
Thank you.
Great. We'll see you all next time, but until then, it's goodbye from me. I'm Tom Harper. Bye.
That Wilbur Smith Show is produced by Christopher Wynne. Music by Dewey DeLay. Executive producer Niso Smith.